thank you very much for being here today with us. It's really great to have an architect like you sharing the room with all these scientists and imagining the space of the Institutes of the Research in the future. And it's great to have an architect like Stefano Boeri, because thinking about these Institutes of the Future, we also want to think about beauty, sustainability, and functionality in the space. And I don't think he's hearing me, but anyway, that's okay. I guess it's introducing.
You're hearing.
You're hearing, okay. It's a bit slow. Sometimes the connection breaks. I hope it's okay for your talk. But Stefano has done his PhD in the Istituto Universitario di Architettura di Venezia, and he's a full professor of urban planning at Milan Politecnico, and he's also the director of the Future City Lab in Shanghai. And he's known for many different buildings, but including the Milan Vertical Forest that has won numerous prizes. And since 2020, Stefano is president of the scientific committee of the Forestami, which is a project that is aimed at planting 3 million trees in the metropolitan area of Milan within 2030. And it's really great to have you here today. So the floor or the screen is yours. Thank you, Stefano.
Okay. So during the pandemic, I had, let's say, happened to many of us the opportunity to let's say, to gather books, movies, and let's say other material that was helping me in a way to survive and to, let's say, go back to some period of elaboration, of theoretical elaboration. And that I wrote this book, which is in a certain way a collection of books. Doesn't work. So the image is the same. So that's something that doesn't work.
Let's try like this. Okay, like this.
We can see the slides. It's just not in presentation mode, but we can still see the slides.
Okay.
So unless you have an animation, it's okay.
So you see here more or less what I've done. I've tried to, on my table, not for sure all the books I have read, but basically it's the books that were, let's say working as real milestones in my encyclopedia. And you know what is enzyme? Enzymes are, let's say, some very, let's say, particular chemical composition that are capable to, let's say, to resist, to stay longer, to last a lot of time. And so in a certain way, our debits are some of the most relevant thinkers of the last 70, 80 years. And well, one of the thinkers that was so important for me, also for how he was writing about the relation between the human sphere and the natural sphere, was well, Michel Foucault. And basically what I did was to go back to an amazing dialogue in Eindhoven, 1971, where Michel Foucault and Noam Chomsky were discussing about the concept of human nature. And Chomsky was, well, talking about how language was important as a kind of generative device in the, let's say, evolution of human thought. And Foucault, from his side, was more or less trying to, let's say, to propose a completely different perspective. The idea of Foucault is that it's impossible to create a barrier between the human cultural sphere and the natural sphere, and that nature is more has to be conceived with something which is unpredictable and suddenly happening inside us, inside, let's say, the sphere of human action. So I really believe that this kind of approach is still extremely contemporary, and probably nothing more than the experience that we had during the pandemic of a microorganism that was working inside us, let's say, transforming the condition of our species and the planet in, let's say, in a few weeks. It's a confirmation of how he is and was totally right. Another thinker that was very important for me is Patrick Geddes. Patrick Geddes is is a biologist, is a ethologist, is an urban planner, and he was studying the evolution of cities in a way that was really, let's say, so advanced in terms of not creating let's say, a kind of binary condition or a binary evolution where you have on one side you have all what is produced by the human cultural artificial environment, and on the other side the natural wild environment. He was really considering cities as living organisms, and this kind of approach I think that was probably not so powerful like the Le Corbusier approach to the evolution of cities, for instance. But his thought, his approach, his perspectives is still alive, and I believe what he have us is still extremely important and crucial. Just to go ahead, another enzymes what was in my mind was the books written by Madeleine de Scudéry. We are in this moment in Paris in a completely different period of the European history, at the beginning of the 17th century, where Madeleine de Scudéry, she was a writer, she was a woman who was gathering, let's say, the scene of the most intriguing thinkers of the period in his saloon. And she was writing a book, Cléry Richter Humain, where he was introducing this idea of carte du tendre, chart of tendresse. And what is amazing in this series of drawings is that she's introducing the subject of the point of view, the subject of the perspective, the subject of the representation in the representation itself. Inside it, you see here the 3-4 protagonists, but how also he was doing a map of emotions, a map of feelings, and how she was putting in connection of this different state of mind, the state of soul, a state of emotion in a geography. So there is always a sentimental geography, a subjective geography that is part of the objective geographical representation that we are asked to develop. We should never forget that this subjectivity is always present, is always there. Just to go ahead, we cannot forget what Joseph Beuys did in terms of reestablishing a new balance between artificial and nature, between cultural and natural environments. And basically, in my opinion, was so great what he did in Kassel, 1982, where he was gathering 7,000 basalt stones at the entrance of Documenta, Kassel, and then he was started to sell and to change this basalt stone with 7,000 oak trees, and then he started to plant the oak trees everywhere in the city, in the courtyard, in the street, in the plaza, everywhere, changing really Kassel. And Kassel has become a green city thanks to what he started to do in 1982. So this concept of a metamorphosis between artificial and natural, it's, in my opinion, something that was so anticipating many of the efforts that we are now to do to make our cities greener. And then again, Jane Goodall, I'm sure you know her well, and she was extremely important for her studies on chimpanzee and the intelligence of the primate. But at the same time, she was reconstructing the living in the forest as a combination and cooperation of different kinds of intelligences. So this cohabitation of different point of views and the necessity to be in condition to put our eyes in the eyes of the other living species was two messages that I will never forget. I think is still so crucial. From the same point of view, I think that also the work for Colin Tudge, it's still so contemporary, still so actual. What he wrote about the circular life of trees, explaining how trees are, let's say, the basement of our life, how trees are the foundation of our life, how trees are capable to, let's say, give us oxygen, glucose, and the nitrates, and all what is necessary for the life of all the species of the planet. And just to, last but not least, I cannot avoid to quote Italo Calvino, who was a very, very famous Italian writer, but well known for the world. And this is a very personal debut with what he wrote in 1961, was a book, 1951, sorry, a book called Il Barone Rampante, the Duke on the Trees, and the Baron on the Trees, sorry, and was a romance about a young duke that decided to abandon his family when he was 12 and to spend the rest of his life staying on the branch of the trees of the forest in Liguria, which is a region in north west Italy. Well, these are some enzymes, but just to tell you that this kind of enzymes are still working with me. For instance, I'm still working when I start to understand what's happening in our planet, and when I start to also to consider the balance between cities and natural environment. So just to do some very, very, let's say, short comparison, cities are occupying, basically they are, let's say, if you could put together small, medium size, large metropolitan environment, megalopolis, well, we'll never cover more than the 3% of the marginal land of the planet. So just this is a stupid, let's say, representation, but imagine that we could do it in Europe is with covering a very small part of Europe. We know that what is the consequence of this. So how, in a certain way, cities are continuing to grow. Never forgetting that the 30% of this urban Pangea is composed by favelas, slums, and informal settlements. So absolute poverty is still a very, very important. 1/3 of our city is nowadays composed by this kind of, let's say, social and also physical environment. But on the other side, we know that cities are consuming natural resources and are producing the 75% of the CO2 of the greenhouse is present in the atmosphere, which is let's say, really the origin of global warming. On the other side, if we consider forests, only forests, well, they will cover the 30% of the surface of the emergent lands, and what they do in terms of capacity to absorb the CO2 that we have already produced and to, let's say, also guarantee us the money of natural resources is still amazing. So I think that we have really to work in order to define a new balance between cities and forest. And just to do a very short exercise, basically the point is how we could imagine that cities stop to become, let's say, the original climate change and to be at the same time the victims, the first victim of the effect of global warming, and how we can make cities the protagonist of a large campaign to reverse global warming or to do our best to reduce the disadvantages of that. This is the center of our book. The book we have just published about, let's say, this idea of green obsession, where we were gathering many of the projects that we are developing in our activity, our action as designer and architects. We started also in this book talking about the idea of Richard Weller. Richard Weller is a famous thinker and teacher in history, who is, let's say, launching this idea of a world park. And world park, in his perspective, is a way to connect all the natural oases, all the natural regions of the planet, all the, let's say, the biodiversity hotspot of the planet with biological and biodiversity corridors. And what he was proposing to do is not so different from what is still happening in Central Africa and the sub-Saharan regions, where a very long and large green wall done by parks, gardens, agricultural fields started to be built since 2009 and is still ongoing. And that's amazing that is now visible from the side that could become a model for other parts of the planet. And we have worked a lot, just to give you an example, in Italy, in order to make this idea of a natural Italia Park, of a Park Italia, was part of the World Park, really something that could be done. So we are still working on that, with the idea that the connection of the biodiversity hotspot is something that is not simply necessary, but is really crucial for what we could do. At the same time, at the scale of cities, we have worked a lot in order to see how this new balance between cities and nature, between artificial and nature, could be reinterpreted as urban designers and planners. And I just give you some idea of what we do. For instance, this is a project of a forest city that we have been asked to design for a region in Cancun, Mexico, southeast Mexico, where there was a project of a huge mall that was stopped after they have basically destroyed a larger part of this mangrove forest. And we have adapted to substitute this concrete platform with an idea of a cities that should be, let's say, innovative, sustainable, and green. And that's what we have done. So the city is a university city for 7 research center universities, where we have more than 7 million of plants. And also in terms of energetic self-sufficiency, it's such a good example of what we should do everywhere in the world. Another example is what we have done in Geneva. We have been asked to imagine the future of Geneva, and we have proposed to see the future of the metropolitan environment not as an extension of the city along the lake, but as the construction of a kind of ring of urban settlements connected with biodiversity corridors, which is a ring. And this ring is exactly superimposed to the ring of the new accelerator of CERN that will be built in the next years. So it will probably also lies the amazing capacity of energy production of the CERN. But what makes this idea, in my opinion, quite innovative is the fact that at the center of this metropolitan constellation, of this metropolitan ring of urban settlement and forest, we don't have a city, we don't have a square, we don't have a monument, we don't have a church or a kiosk or a mosque, but we have a mountain. So the Salève is the core of the metropolitan environment. And this idea to have a city which has at its center a mountain is, in my opinion, something that we should study well and develop in other part of the world. This is, as you see, an idea of how it could work, this view from the center of the city. But this idea of, let's say, study how we could imagine a cohabitation and cooperation between different living species, something that we started to do also some years ago in Milan Politecnico, where we are launching a research on animal city. And we were studying with students how we could imagine to have inside our city places where the other species can, let's say, develop their habitat without being oppressed by our presence, but at the same time studying also other places where the cohabitation could become possible. This is such a delicate and crucial issue. But in all the case, what we have to do is to never forget that to do that, we have to accept to stay in the eyes of the others and observe what we do from their eyes. Okay, we're done in Milano. We are now following the project to plant 3 million trees by 2030. Which is also a way to deal with the health and how, come dice la calore urbano? Heating of our cities has become more and more strong in the last decades. And this is some of the projects that we have done in relation to this Forestami project in order to introduce a new natural environment inside the cities. But as I was saying, probably the most famous or the most known project is the Bosco Verticale in Milano. This is a project that we have finished to build in 2040. It hosts 22,000 plants, more than 800 trees, and many different species of shrubs and other plants. And this project is an interesting, let's say, case study, and also an interesting example of cohabitation between plants, humans, birds, insects. So it's a real ecosystem, and we are really studying it, how it works in after 10 years of its life, and we have learned a lot from this observation in terms of how to improve the water management, how to improve the selection of plants, how to study, for instance, how the technology that can help us to make the plant capable to be also alive in this extremely condition, and many important things that we are doing, like in terms of maintenance of the building. And we are being extremely proud to see that this project was used as an icon for representing the 11 sustainable goals of the United Nations some months ago. Just to conclude, we are, as you can imagine, developing this idea of a relational architectural nature, where nature is not a decoration or ornamental presence, but is a basic component of what we do. And in other parts of the world, like this is Eindhoven, where we have developed a social housing, vertical forest, which is very, low-cost building, where we have demonstrated that it's possible to imagine to have the same kind of architecture, of green architecture, affordable for everybody, That's exactly the same we are most proud. And this is basically a building inhabited by students and with rental presence. The same we are doing in China. This is a Hawangang, two other social housing building. And in other parts of the world, I was simply to conclude with initial connected with water, sun, and shadow. These are the three of the main issues of the city in the next future. So also we were talking about the heat risk in what's happening in terms of global warming. This is a satellite view of Milano last August, and you see how the vertical forest is one of the places where we can try to deal with this in excess. And you can imagine how it's important to use shadow. And we are now also developing this project in the desert. This is Abu Dhabi, and we're studying how a vertical forest could be adaptable to arid condition. And this is a way also to learn what we could do in Southern Europe or Central Europe, what to do in the next year in terms of water management, capacity to absorb the energy of the sun, to have building that works like, plants capacity to produce clean energy in many ways. And that's also another project that we have developed for a city in the desert, where we are making this city green, thanks to a very, advanced use of the water. So thank you so much. And I'm very sorry for the technical complication we had. And thank you again.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Could you take a question if there is a question from the audience?
Yes.
Okay, I'll go ahead if there is no question. And because actually your talk links also wonderfully with the previous talk, where we had a scientist that works actually on animal behavior. So in your team, do you mix people? I guess, because you touch ecology, you touch also potentially animal behavior and many different things. And you could even use your buildings as a source for experimentation, because you can have setups that we could use for experimentation also. So what sort of team do you work with?
Well, it's a multidisciplinary team for sure. Otherwise, I've been able to try to to develop any of these proposals. So from the beginning, we are working with botanists, we are working with ethologists, and then for sure also as we are used to work with sociologists, anthropologists. So we believe that architecture is one of the way to, make this combination of thoughts capable to land in a place and to help us to see the future.
It's really beautiful and very, very inspiring. We have just another question here, and then we have to move to the next speaker. There in the middle. Yeah? Just one question here.
Thank you. I was wondering, I really liked the work that you are planning for Geneva in CERN. So since we are in a meeting talking about research infrastructures in the future, and ideally the scientists should be involved also with the people, the citizens, how could you envision not only to bring biodiversity into a research center, but also how you can make it architecturally functional in terms of working with other people in the city?
Yeah, no, I think it's the two are, let's say, part of the same vision. So the concept of biodiversity is not simply a way to calculate the number of living species that are cohabiting in an environment. It's much more. It's a drastic, radical change of perspective. It's the capacity that you have to put your eyes in the eyes of another living subject and to see the same things, the same places, the same environment from a different perspective. So this is strictly connected with the responsibility that we have now as a dominant species to not, let's say, forget what we are, what we have done, also not forget our amazing but huge mistakes, but to, let's say, use this power to try to have develop a kind of empathic strategy on the future.
Thank you very much. It was really enlightening and really beautiful. Thank you very much, Stefano, for being here.